Well, good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. Today is Sunday, July 25th, and this is Life Matters. Come on, let's talk about it. Well, hello, everybody. Hello, everybody. My name is Michele Irby Johnson, and I am your host. This is Life Matters with Michele. Thank you so much for tuning in once again. I appreciate all of your love, your sentiments, your attention, how you come in every single week and support Life Matters with Michele. We want to remind you that this is where we talk about what matters to you, particularly in the African American community. And we want to always make sure we give you space to provide your questions for our special guest on today, who happens to be none other than Reketta Nesmith, who is going to be discussing trauma on today. Hello, my dear. How are you?
Hello. Hi, I'm doing good.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us on today. I am always excited when I bring new faces in. She came recommended by a mutual friend of ours. I'm going to throw her name out there, Miss Aisha Rosenborough. And I'm just appreciative that she connected the two of us. And so again, I'm excited to talk to Miss Reketta Nesmith today. And today we're going to talk about trauma. And we all know that trauma is something that many of us experience, and some of us remember it, some of us do not. But we're gonna unpack it a little bit in this hour that we have. But before we dive in, I want to introduce this woman of God to you all. She is a licensed professional clinical counselor, and she is a clinical therapist for San Bernardino County Superintendent of Schools, and she shares her gift to the world of overcoming and victory through her therapeutic interventions. Her goal is to continue helping families who have experienced trauma or stressors to learn healthy interventions, healthy interventions through dyadic art, talk therapy, and play therapy. She is also a certified domestic violence advocate and author that continues to help women and children who have experienced domestic violence and trauma to be healed through the power of Jesus Christ. Now, let me just say this right here, right now. If this turns to church, y'all be all right. Because of those of y'all who know me, y'all know I'm a pastor. And so I might drop a few scriptures here and there, and the Holy Ghost might show up. So y'all will be all right. Y'all will be all right. Once again, we are talking to none other than Miss Reketta Nesmith, and we are talking about trauma. Now, Reketta, one thing I like to do is I like to introduce our audience to, some type of working definition. So if you can give us the definition of trauma in a simplistic form, because everybody doesn't, they can't take the deep dive into the clinical definition. But if you can give us something that is, palatable for those who are not as well versed in trauma as yourself and I.
Yes. So the simplistic version is basically it's an emotional response to an event or an experience that has been distressing or disturbing. And some examples of trauma could be domestic violence. It could be rape. Also, some things that people usually don't think of as trauma could be like a move, so moving from another city to another place, or even something unexpectedly happening that you just didn't plan for, a divorce, or even like the pandemic. So that's definitely a traumatic event that some people don't always classify as a trauma.
Yeah. And sometimes people use trauma and crisis interchangeably. And so, one thing I like to teach in my classes is, crisis is when your normalcy has been disrupted. There's now a disequilibrium in what would have been your normal coping mechanisms. And so now you don't know how to, say for instance, if your house burns down, you're in a moment of crisis. But trauma can stem from that crisis. Am I right?
Yes, correct. Yes. And I think a lot of times people may view trauma as it being this, I don't know, like sometimes I feel like people only see trauma as like death or abuse, and trauma can be something that it may be traumatic for another person, and you may not have had that same emotional response. And so for you, you may have not been affected traumatically by it, but just because you didn't respond in the same way that the other person did, it doesn't mean that they didn't experience that as a trauma.
Or that you didn't experience it, because a lot of oftentimes, and I might be going ahead of us, oftentimes just because we don't have a visceral response to something doesn't mean it didn't affect us. So I'll put myself on the table. You say we always categorize trauma as, domestic violence, death, abuse. But when I started losing my hair, now it was a slow process, but then 2 years ago, I was wearing this little wiglet. I was pulling my hair up and covering it up. And it was, and it got to the point there was nothing to hold on to. I was tightening up the rubber bands as much as possible. But when I looked in the mirror and realized that I looked like Bozo the Clown, or I looked like Benjamin Franklin, because my hair was from here down. And I wept about that thing. That thing traumatized me. I'm like, well, what am I supposed to do? I'm not going to have any hair. And my then fiance said, you would be beautiful bald. But I had a real response. I was traumatized thinking, what am I going to look like without hair? But most people are like, well, why would you be traumatized by that? Because that's my response. And
Right.
we can't equate our response to somebody else's and make it the same, right?
Right, exactly. And I think sometimes that's why many people may isolate or kind of shrink back and not voice their trauma, or tell people like, okay, this is how I'm feeling, I'm going through this traumatic event, and these are my emotions, because a lot of times it's downplayed, or most people don't know how to encourage others, or they don't know how to respond. And sometimes other people have experienced trauma, but they may be so used to just kind of brushing it under the rug and pretending as if it didn't happen. And so when traumatic experiences happen, they don't really know how to classify that as a trauma, and it's just kind of a part of life. But really, they haven't taken the time to like just stop and pause and be like, okay, maybe I should speak to someone about that, or maybe there is something going on here that I need to process.
Yeah, and I'm glad you said that. I was going to say they don't process it, and I will be I'll raise my hand. I was a victim of domestic violence. I escaped my domestic violence relationship 24 years ago, and I never went to counseling. But I think through the process of time and me helping other people, that became my outlet to kind of release it and to shake it off. I mean, I don't have the residual effects like I did, back then, but I think that's the word that we need to understand, that we have to process it. We have to comb through it. We have to unearth it. We have to dig through the layers and see how it really affected us. Because like you said, a lot of us, we downplay it, and we're like, okay, well, I'm good with it because, I'm strong, especially as women. I'm a strong Black woman, so I can handle anything, but it's going to show up somewhere, right?
Right, exactly. And then there are even different types of trauma, like secondhand trauma. Then you have complex trauma, acute trauma, chronic. And so some of them may be a prolonged period of time, some may be a short period. And so again, I think sometimes when it is prolonged, that it just kind of becomes a part of life and you don't recognize it as an actual traumatic event. And eventually it does catch up with you. And just like you said, I'm a domestic violence survivor as well. And there's still different parts of the healing process that I go through daily. And so sometimes I may feel like, okay, I've overcome this part, and then I'll notice like something emotionally or something that may trigger me may happen. And then I may think back to a time in my past during the domestic violence. And so then I have to be like, okay, Reketta, what triggered that? What thought was connected to that? What do I need to do to continue to encourage myself, or what do I not need to do to remove those negative thoughts? And so it's a process. And I feel like with any type of traumatic experience, whether it's big or small, that's a process, and you have to learn how to cope with it, and to see what needs are being unmet and what needs that need to be met in that situation.
That's good. That's good. And so you touched on the different types of trauma. So you said complex, acute. So can you just give us an example, or again, something for the normal person? Because you and I, we can banter on the deeper things, but give us those types of trauma again, and just give us a snippet of what that would look like before we get into the types of the different signs of trauma.
So like for acute trauma, that's just a single incident. So something that just happened one time. So for instance, if you lost your job, that could be a trauma. So that's just a one-time thing. And it's still a traumatic experience, but it may impact you differently. Chronic trauma is repeated and prolonged trauma. So that could be, for instance, domestic violence or sexual abuse, something that happened, over time. And then you have complex trauma, where it's multiple traumatic events. And it's also interpersonal. And so it could be multiple things, where you're going through domestic violence, now you're going through divorce, and now you're also having, maybe changes with your mental and emotional health, and maybe going through depression, and causing different areas of your life to kind of fall apart. So maybe you may be in jeopardy of losing your job. So it's multiple things at once. And secondhand trauma is when the trauma hasn't necessarily happened directly to you, but even knowing a person who has been traumatized, because now I know they have something different in the DSM. You don't necessarily have to have been the person to experience the trauma to have PTSD, but to even know or hear someone talk about that can be traumatic too, because if you've never been through those experiences before, and it's like sometimes you actually have the image in your mind and you can see and feel those things, and especially if you're a person who empathizes with others, and you're very emotional, sometimes you can take on those things yourself and experience that secondhand trauma.
That's good. That's good. Thank you so much. So just to recap, we have acute, chronic, complex, and secondhand trauma.
Mm-hmm.
I tell you, I wish we had time, because we could unpack those things right there. So when we're talking about trauma, again, this is something that disrupts, your normal flow of life, something that has, essentially unraveled your coping mechanism, your ability to handle, life as you used to. Give us some signs of trauma. So somebody who's been through it, but again, like you said, they swept it out under the rug, or they've, downplayed it, or they've ignored it because, they're so used to, I got to grind because I got to take care of these children. And they've pretty much just kept living above the trauma and not handling it. So give us some signs of what trauma looks like on the surface, and what trauma would look like, as an undercurrent. Does that make sense?
Yes. So I would say, just using an example from myself, When I was experiencing trauma, for me, I isolated myself. I didn't get much sleep. For me, I didn't eat much. And I even noticed when, my emotions are just everywhere. Sometimes I may have felt depressed. I felt like a sadness. I was withdrawing from normal activities. You just start to feel fatigued, not really wanting to do like your usual activities, um, having a fear that these things are going to continue to happen or to repeat the cycle. And so then you just become so anxious to the point where you try not to be in those type of situations. So even if it's something like, say, if you were involved in a shooting or something, so you just completely try to not go outside because that's where the shooting took place, and because you may have flashbacks, or you may just have thoughts about reoccurring thoughts of that happening, or having nightmares and just different dreams about what took place. And so it can impact people differently. And some people may see some symptoms, like some people may not experience not feeling like eating. Some people may just experience the nightmares and may not want to do certain activities, or may not want to be involved at that specific place or event where it took place. So it looks different for everyone.
And I would even dare to say that sometimes those signs could be covert and overt. So, say a person, has started eating more than usual as opposed to loss of appetite, they may now be overindulging, and now they're not understanding, they keep saying, I'm hungry, but they're actually feeding the pain, but they don't know it because they've not addressed it.
Right.
Right. So,
Exactly. Right. And that's another thing, because a lot of times when we experience trauma, we usually tend to turn to unhealthy habits and unhealthy coping skills, because it's just easier to do those things when you're having a challenging time like that. And so it may be overindulging in food, or even overindulging in alcohol, or turn into drugs, or just doing different things that you may not have found yourself doing before to cope with the pain. And sometimes people may find that they think that's where their healing is going to come from. And in reality, it's making the situation worse, and it causes you to just be more hindered. And I know for me, like, it just will cause me to be more isolated, to feel more shame and guilt. Then you feel like you really can't get out of this situation, and you just start to it becomes more than just trauma. It starts to become depression, or it starts to become anxiety, or sometimes it can even turn into eating disorder, anorexia, or it just gets deeper and deeper.
yeah, because oftentimes, if we keep it on the relationship scale, oftentimes, because when you're going through the gaslighting, or you're living with a narcissist or something like that, and you've started to internalize the lies that they've said to you about you, and so again, that would turn to something like an eating disorder, or it would turn to, some other extraneous habits, like, dare I say, porn or something like that, to
Right.
help to bathe or to soothe what you're feeling. And so if the person told you weren't sexy, now maybe your outlet or your coping mechanism or your response to it, maybe now you're dressing more provocative than you ever did. And people are like, why are you dressing like that? Well, this is what I like. Not really. That's really a byproduct of what somebody said to you, and you internalize it. And as a result of the trauma, you are now living it out. Am I
Right.
right? Am I right, ma'am?
Right, exactly. Yes, that is very true. And like, it could be connected to so many different things. Like, that's how you start to connect with different relationships, because then that's how you start to view yourself
Mhm.
That's how you start to disconnect yourself from certain relationships because maybe you feel like you aren't worthy to even be a part of that relationship, or you start to lose friendships, or just different things that may have been healthy for you. You start to pull away from those things and to lose connections or maybe burn bridges with people. And then it just becomes really difficult and challenging to continue moving forward. And so you kind of feel lost. You start to feel like, okay, what am I supposed to do now? Who do I turn to? And
Mhm.
if you don't know who your source is, and you don't, have faith and really trusting and believing in the Lord, then it really can be hard. And even trusting and believing in the Lord, because when I was going through my situation, I was a Christian and I believed in God, but I wasn't, I didn't really have like a relationship with God the way that I wanted to,
Mhm.
because I wanted that relationship with this man more than I wanted it with the Lord. And I see how that definitely did have a negative impact on me, and it hindered me because I believed what the man was saying more than what I believed what God was saying.
Well, that's a whole different story. We can have a group on here and we can discuss that one openly and plainly, because I promise you, you are not the only one who has sat in that chair. Yes. And so when we talk about trauma, let's talk a little about, are there particular disorders that may fall under trauma? So we know PTSD is one. Is
Mhm.
what about dissociative disorder? Can you name some of the things that would come as a result that would fall in line with mental health?
Yes, definitely. I feel like anxiety, like generalized anxiety disorder, can come from trauma as well, because you're constantly being anxious about something, and even if you look at the actual symptoms of generalized anxiety disorder, some of them are similar to post traumatic stress disorder. It's just certain ones that aren't on there, where like one symptom may be missing from post-traumatic stress disorder, and which means okay, you'll fall under generalized anxiety disorder or adjustment disorder. So just like how I was saying, a move, and people may not even see that as a trauma, like because you had to move from one place to another or switch schools, or even I think about foster kids, like sometimes
Yes.
they have multiple moves, and that's traumatic in itself because they already lost their parents pretty much, and now they're not being wanted in this one home, and then they have to go to another home. So moving, say even if it's no longer being in a certain position and you're demoted, or that, and people don't express those things, or they may not really say how they're feeling and they just have it in their mind, but it's a trauma because it can cause an emotional disturbance for you. And so again, a car accident, and then people may not want to drive anymore, or just being fearful. So yeah, I can think of anxiety disorder, adjustment disorder, um, different eating disorders, uh, so many. I wish I had my DSM and
This is good. This good because what I wanted to what I want is to, for people who are watching and or listening, I want them to be able to hear, because I don't expect you to wrangle off the DSM-5, because that would we would be here all day until Jesus come, giving them codes and layers, and this falls under this, and they'd be like, well, what in the world? So no, this is fine. I mean, I just want to give them a general idea, a general perspective, something that they can at least look up and say, oh, I wonder if this is what Susie is dealing with, or I wonder if this is what I'm dealing with. And so, as you said, you have generalized anxiety disorder, PTSD, dissociative disorder, adjustment disorders, eating disorders. That's enough. I mean, so many things can fall under each one of those. But I just thought it was important that people understand that trauma can, you can have a visceral response That can be emotional, that can be mental, that can be financial, because you're not able to cope with what is now your new normal. It can affect the whole span of your life. So the spectrum of your life can be disrupted, because now your life looks nothing like you thought it would look like. It looks nothing like it looked like a week ago, a year ago, 5 years ago. Looks nothing like you dreamed about. And so now you're stuck in what you could have had or should have had. And then when you said something about moving, the first thing I thought about is children, not just in foster care, but military children who have to constantly, when their parent has the PCS, or pay what we call a permanent change of station. I'm a veteran, I'm a disabled veteran. And so when they have to change locations, and they're just getting their good friends, and they've only been somewhere for 3 years, and now they have to move, and God forbid they have to move in high school years, that creates a whole nother level of hormones and fighting with the children, because they're like, I hate you, but they don't really hate you. They hate the fact that you're in the military and you have to change duty stations, which means they have to leave their friends and their activities. And so now it brings on a whole nother dynamic to your household, where you're fighting with your children and fighting with your spouse and all of those various things. We have a question from, we have several questions from our audience. Let me see if I can touch on some of them. How is trauma assessed? And what is the process and observations from a clinical role? I think we touched a little bit about that, but how do you assess trauma from a clinical standpoint?
I would assess trauma through what is your emotional response to whatever has occurred. And again, to not, I think because, like you said before, we're so used to being strong. And, we were told, even some people as children were taught to not be emotional or to not cry, and just different things where it does go into adulthood. And so a way to assess your trauma, well, first would be to talk to a professional. So talking to a mental health professional. And I do advocate therapy. And so even as a therapist myself, I receive therapy. And I think it's really important, even if you feel like, okay, I'm doing well, I don't really have any problems or any issues. But if you know that you have been through any type of traumatic experience, like I said, a move, a divorce, a car accident, even if it's just in changing positions, losing a friend, and not even necessarily losing them to death, but just losing them, period. And most people in their lives have experienced some type of trauma, whether you acknowledge it or not, like you've experienced some type of trauma. So I think the first step is like really thinking and reflecting on the things that you have been through in life, and being like, okay, let me talk to a professional to see if this is something that I do need help with, and to begin to process your feelings. So like, how are you responding to it? Are you responding to it by just completely avoiding it and not communicating about it? And, you're telling yourself you're good, but do you notice that you're irritable or angry? Are you responding to it by, projecting onto other people, and maybe projecting what your feelings are onto another person? Is it something that's constantly in your mind? Are you having stress? Are you overwhelmed? And sometimes it may not even be anything that has happened, like in that specific time frame or in that situation, and you notice yourself being negative towards a person or being irritable, and they didn't even do anything to you to have that irritability. And so it has to be something else that's deeper that you need to process. So that's a way that you can assess, and even asking your friends or family, like, okay, have I, been a little irritable lately? Has everything been okay between us? Or, when you know yourself, like you know yourself better than anyone else does. And I think having that reflection, really asking God, for me, prayer, asking God, like, okay, help me with my emotions, or show me what it is that I need to evaluate and assess. And I think, again, talking to a counselor and being able to help process through those things, because sometimes we kind of just brush it under the rug for so long, we feel like it doesn't bother us, or it's not impacting us negatively.
And that can be farther from the truth because, like I tell everybody, I said just because it's buried doesn't mean it's dead. So it can show up somewhere when you least expect it. It can show up in a meeting. It can show up in your current relationship, and you're like, well, I don't know where that came from. That's because them bones are going to try and rise again, and so they're trying to
Mhm.
make their entrance into your life. And there was something that you said when you said, you go to therapy. And I thought that was so key because as counselors, we take on other people's weight, and we know from a spiritual perspective, spirits transfer. So if you're sitting with somebody and you've had 5 clients today and they've all talked about, XYZ trauma, whatever, you have become, your spirit has now connected with that. And so there's got to be a place for you to deposit it, dump it, or whatever. And so it's very important because you now have to get yourself cleansed or purged from what you've been listening to, which essentially could be secondhand trauma, because you're now listening to, and in your head you're going, poof, but your face is like, tell me more. But you're like, oh my God, did they just tell me that? And you really want to hide under your desk, but what they've told you, you have to keep a stoic face and like, so tell me about that. And in
Right.
your head you're going, oh my God. so
Right.
so I'm so glad that you said that. We have another question that says, how does trauma affect marriage or relationships? What are the dangers or the harms or the red flags that you might see?
That's a really good question. Yes. How does it affect the relationship? Well, one, if you're not dealing with your trauma, firsthand, then it definitely can bleed over into the relationship, and it can cause people to constantly to butt heads. And then eventually maybe someone can become like, okay, I don't want to talk to this person anymore, or it'll be difficult to communicate within your relationship. And then that's when you find yourself even emotionally detached, and you just don't know how to communicate. And I think some of the red flags, when you're starting to avoid communicating, when you know that you're experiencing certain emotions, or you know that you're just having certain thoughts and feelings, and you just try to avoid it or not say anything about it, and you just keep it buried. But again, that's not healthy, because that shows that you're just burying it deeper and deeper, but eventually it's going to come out. And whether or not it comes out on that person, it's going to come out on someone. And
Yes.
so sometimes it comes out on the person that didn't even do anything, or didn't even know what was going on within you. And so then, even with all of that emotionally stress and emotional torment, it can affect your health too. It can affect your physical health. You start not being able to sleep well at night. You lose your focus and concentration. You aren't able to stay on task at work. Just your daily activities, not even like you can physically be somewhere, but not mentally and emotionally be there.
Yeah.
And it's almost as if you're there, but you're disconnected with what's going on around you. And sometimes it does impact just how you engage with others. You're no longer really having enjoyable moments. You no longer really have happiness, or you're not really doing the things that you enjoy doing anymore, and you just kind of lose interest in those things. And who wants to be around someone who's always irritable or angry, or someone who's always anxious and frustrated, or someone who's always down and sad? And so
Yeah.
you will start to see yourself lose relationships. And then ultimately, it could end in divorce or separation. And so I think that it is good to, again, have counseling. And I think the number one thing is, even before getting into a marriage, making sure that you're whole as a person first.
Come on, ma'am. Come, that's a whole nother show. That's a whole nother show because
Yeah.
again, we can sit in that one for about 3 hours. But
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yes, because then you start to bring all of these things into the relationship, and then your baggage and all of your shame and guilt and your feelings and emotions becomes the other person's
Mhm.
too. And then it's like it just starts to weigh down the relationship. And so I think, again, it's important to have, your individual counseling sessions too. And then if you feel like, okay, we need to start to bring it together as a family. But if you know it's some things that you have to work on personally within yourself that does not even deal with another person, then you should do that first. Because before you're able to do a family session and you don't even have yourself, like you don't see what some of the emotions or challenges that you're dealing with. Sometimes it's hard to bring a session together because it's like, all right, they're not even on the same page, or they don't know like what's going on with their own feelings and emotions. So I think sometimes it is good to have the individual therapy, but I also think having family therapy works wonders as well.
Absolutely. I had to write down here, I said self care curtails sabotage.
Hmm.
So if you take care of yourself, then you don't have to worry about bleeding on other people or hurting other people. You know, they always say hurt people hurt people. But if
Hmm.
you don't tend to the to the pain, you're going to put that on somebody else. And I always say, whether I'm preaching or teaching or counseling, I always tell people God can't heal what you don't reveal. And so if you don't share that with, somebody, then ultimately it's going to show up, it's going to manifest itself at the wrong time, at the wrong place, with the wrong person. You might flick off on your boss and it has nothing to do with them, but because you've not dealt with what's seated in you, then it manifests itself and it comes out and not coming to work on time or being snappy and snippy and all of these various things that we've discussed. There's a question, I think you already dealt with this. It says, do you think that COVID-19, the pandemic, has caused a surge in traumatic mental health patients? I will say yes.
Absolutely. Yes, I feel like we will never go out of business. Like, I feel like it's opened up way more opportunities to do counseling and for mental health. Yes, because people struggle, including myself. Again, as a therapist, I like to just be real and genuine with people, because I think that sometimes we think that we have to have it all together. And just because we're in a certain profession that we're supposed to be the ones with all the answers, and like we don't need help, which is very untrue. Like I find myself needing more help now, even just being in this field. And for me, like in the beginning of it, I felt like I was good. And then there were some parts where I was starting to get a little shaky with the pandemic. And I was like, wow, I've been in the house too long. I wasn't taking walks. I wasn't getting any type of sunlight. I was starting to just feel more isolated. And so I had to do things for myself. And then that's when I was like, okay, I need to be consistent with therapy. I need to get back in it and to do it for myself. But yes, people turn to alcohol, people turn to drugs during the pandemic, people turn to sex, people just started doing all kinds of different things, and
Yeah.
which ultimately it did impact them negatively. And unfortunately, some people don't even realize the effects and impact that the pandemic had on them, and they just feel like that's just who they are.
Yeah, yeah, which is unfortunate. But if they look back at their track history and they say, okay, well, where did that come from? When did that show up? You have to start tracking your own life. You have to pay attention to the seasons in your own life, because if you don't, you will miss something that is vital. And it could be detrimental to yourself and those around you and those that you love. We have another question, says, what is the impact of racial trauma in the Black community and the Black church? So we can talk about that, but then I want to float that over to the barriers that we face in our community when it comes to getting help for trauma.
Wow, that's a real deep one. You guys are asking some amazing questions. Yes, like that's real too. We saw that a lot. And especially not being able to go anywhere or do anything, and now it's blatant. And even though we saw, racial trauma and we've seen it for years, but I think just because life was on pause and the world was now able to see it, it affected us differently. And
Mm-hmm.
usually, even for myself included, I was one of those people who really didn't pay attention when there was like a racial trauma that would happen. It was just kind of like, okay, it's just another day. Like, what do I do about it? And I would just brush it under the rug. And then I did start to notice that was one of the reasons why I started becoming very emotional, because then I would see things on social media and then hear about it on the news. And then I was expected to go to work and provide counseling within that same time. And then I'm like, man, I'm still trying to process all these things that happen. And I remember finding myself crying like right before a session, and I was like, how am I going to pull this together? I don't even want to talk. I don't want to listen to anyone. Like, this just happened, and no one really cares about what's going on, in my mind. And even though, again, it's not that it happened to me, but seeing other people go through those things,
Mm-hmm.
it really does affect you negatively. And I remember my work having an open space for us to talk about it. And I guess I didn't really know how to feel about it in the moment. And I was like, they don't really care. They're just trying to have this discussion. But then I was glad that they did openly have the discussion, because then it did at least make me feel like, okay, now the world is seeing, and they are being open-minded, and they are wanting to be educated, and even hearing like my church talk about it more as well, and not just talk about something, but asking like, okay, how can we help this situation? What can we do to make it better? Because then it did start to become like, all right, I'm seeing everyone repost these things on social media, but like, how is it really affecting change, or how do I go about helping with change too? And still, until this day, I feel like there's more that I can do when it
Mm-hmm.
comes to racial trauma, because I haven't really been, I think, as much as an advocate as I would like to be. And so just being able to provide therapy to African Americans. And sometimes I get so sad because a lot of my cases, I don't always see a lot of African Americans, or when I do, again, myself included, because I know I have been very inconsistent when it came to therapy. You don't always see consistency with it. And it's like, man, I really want to be able to help, and to provide the therapy. But sometimes, I don't know, I think it therapy sometimes, we view it as like we're not telling all of our secrets, or like they're not going to be able to help us. I've tried that before. And so sometimes it is challenging.
Yeah, and having you say that, that just rolls us over into barriers, because the first thing you said you don't see a lot of African Americans in your practice, and that is a barrier. If we don't see someone that looks like us, who can relate to us, and I'm not by any means kicking other races who are therapists. I'm not saying that, but there's a certain level of comfortability that you have when you sit in front of somebody that looks like you, that knows your vernacular, that knows your history, not your personal history, but historically where we come from and the things that, shake us and shape us at the same time. And so when we don't have therapists that look like us, it becomes a barrier, because they don't know me. They're not going to be able to relate to, why I'm upset because they won't let me wear my braids, or why they're upset and they want me to put on a wig, or why they're upset because they can't relate. And so oftentimes it's a barrier, and people don't want to go talk to people who don't look like us because you cannot relate to us. So outside of, relatability, what are some of the other barriers that hinders the African American from community from going to counseling?
I think I honestly believe that it starts with our childhood and just our history, connecting with our family. Like, if your parents didn't teach you that, okay, there's an effective way to process your feelings and to communicate, and you just saw, arguments, or you just saw a negative way of communication, and you didn't grow up educated about therapy and just having healthy communication, then it definitely can impact you. And I know growing up, I didn't necessarily have the best experience in being able to witness effective communication. I don't think I've ever saw my parents go to therapy, and I never heard it talked about. And even with just a stigma about mental health, just something personally about myself. I had a very close member of my family that was diagnosed with schizophrenia. And so for me, that was like really huge. And that's why I really wanted to be a part of like this field. And I started getting into therapy and wanting to do it. But I think sometimes a barrier could be like, okay, I didn't get therapy when I was growing up, and look at how I turned out, and people think
Right.
they're fine.
I'm okay.
Right. And then some people see it as spreading your family's business, or even having to get that deep. And because there are going to be some things that come up that you may not want to talk about, and there are going to be some dark parts that you felt like you never would share with anyone. And then it may become like, okay, am I being disloyal to my family if I share this? And again, I can only share from personal experience. Like, even with myself, sometimes I'm like, I don't know if I want to share that with my therapist just yet. Like, she's going to think I'm crazy or something. And so sometimes you only get out of therapy of what you're willing to give.
Absolutely.
And so if you're willing to give the bare minimum, then you're going to get the bare minimum.
Absolutely.
If you're willing to like really fully give yourself and to be honest and genuine and be like, look, this is what happened. I know that there are stages and phases through the process. And so, you have the beginning phase of therapy, and, until your termination phase, and you have that middle stage. And so it's not going to be like you just share everything automatically. But if you're only willing to share like just bits and pieces, then of course you're not going to feel like you're getting anywhere, or that it's moving forward. But sometimes I think that we can hold our own selves back because we're not willing to give certain information, maybe because of embarrassment, or feeling shame or guilt, or just past things that have happened in our lives that we want to bury and we don't ever want to think about again.
Yeah.
But it's going to be buried, but ultimately it's still in your mind. Like, it's still bothering you in some way.
It's still alive somewhere. It's living somewhere. Ladies and gentlemen, just want to remind you all that we are talking to none other than Miss Reketta Nesmith, and we are talking about trauma. If you're just tuning in, this has been a very robust discussion about trauma, and we're now discussing in this moment about the different types of barriers that particularly affect our community, the African American community. And I think it's a matter of interest and importance that we remember that healing can only take place when we step up to the plate and want it. And so we can't want healing but expect somebody else to do it. And so there were a number of things that you said. I can't regurgitate them all, but one thing I'll just encapsulate it like this, and I'll say that oftentimes we don't get what we need because of shame, and we would much rather live in pain than to deal with, what's haunting us. And so, ladies and gentlemen, we've got to make the time to get ourselves better so we can be better for ourselves, better for our children, and the generations to come. If you would like to talk to Miss Reketta after the show, you may certainly reach out to her on her website, which is www.rekettasmith.com. That's www.rekettasmith.com. You can also email her at rekettasmith@yahoo.com. Once again, that is rekettasmith.com, or email Reketta Nesmith at yahoo.com. Once again, we are talking to Miss Reketta Nesmith, and we are talking about trauma. Before we get some final words, let me get in a few announcements here. I want to remind each and every one of you that my latest book that just came out, In Recovery, Rising from the Ruins, is for sale. It is for sale for $15. If you would like a copy, please email me at Michele at iam-mij.com. That is Michele at iam-mij.com for the purchase link. Also, for those of you who are military, whether you are veterans, spouses, no matter the branch of service, doesn't matter. I'm doing a new work called Boots and Beyond. And if you are interested, please send me an email. The last day to sign up is actually the 26th or the 27th. But if you're interested, if you're military, whether you are retired, active, guard, all branches of service, please, ma'am, please, sir, reach out to me at Michele at iam-mij.com. Last announcement. No, it's not. If you are a BBB, I call us the Bald, Bold, and Beautiful Sisters of Queens. I'm doing another book called My Bald is Beautiful, and there will be an interest meeting held on August the 5th at 7:00 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, looking for authors for that work as well. Once again, another book interest meeting called My Bald is Beautiful. If you are bald due to alopecia, cancer treatments, medications gone wild, whatever the case may be, burn victim, and you have no hair, but you are sporting your BBB, you are bald, bold, and beautiful, certainly meet me on August the 5th at 7:00 p.m. Via Zoom. You can find all of that information on not on YouTube, or what's that thing called? Facebook. And if you were not able to catch the entire show today, you can watch it on YouTube at Michele Life Matters with Michele TV Official. Once again, that is Life Matters with Michele TV Official. You can watch the replay there. And then you can also listen to it every Friday at 4:00 p.m. on sensationalsoundsradio.net. That is www.sensationalsounds.net. We're everywhere. So you can't say that you didn't see the show, couldn't watch the show, couldn't hear the show. We are there. And lastly, I promise this is the last one. If you would like to be a guest on the show for November or December, I'm booked up until those times. Please send me an email at go to my website at www.iam-mij.com/contact us. Whew, that was a lot. Either way, reach out to me. Once again, ladies and gentlemen, we are talking to Miss Reketta Nesmith, and we're talking about trauma. My dear sweet sister, we are running close to the end of our time, but if you would, give us some final thoughts as it relates to trauma.
Yes. Basically, if you didn't take anything away, what I would like you to take away from this is to just seek the help. Whether it's seeking a professional, most importantly, seeking God. I always say Jesus in therapy is the best combination, and really being genuine with yourself, and finding someone who you can trust to be able to at least communicate your feelings, and to know that you are not alone. And if you feel like, okay, I don't have a trusted individual that I can go to, you can email me, go to my website, One thing that I did want to mention, I'm an author and I wrote a book called His Sorry Transformed My Life. And it's this
Oh,
right here. And so it specifically does talk about my domestic violence abuse that I went through, but also I do think that it would be beneficial for anyone who has experienced trauma. And so not only does it talk about, just my story, but it also has healthy outlets. So it's like an art journal where you're able to use therapeutic outlets, and it just gives you different things that you can do as self-care and to be able to help process some of your emotions as well. So you can find the link to the book on my website at RekettaNesmith.com.
and how much is the book? Because I got to get one from my library. You see all these books, but you can't see them all. But you see all these books back, and I have boxes of books that aren't even on the shelf.
Yes.
I need a copy of that just for my library.
Yes, it's $15.99. And so again, you could go on my website and order your copy. And so yes, I would love you guys to be able just to something an encouraging story, and not only just to be encouraged, but also for you to have a healthy outlet too. And also, I have different like scriptures in there just so you can pray and to read the scriptures, because I think that's again very important. So not only just having therapy, but also making sure that you're using biblical principles as well, and actually applying it to your life.
Awesome, awesome. Once again, ladies and gentlemen, we have been talking to the Reketta Nesmith, and we've been talking about trauma today. Again, if you missed any part of the show, you can go back and watch it on YouTube, which will be found at Life Matters with Michele TV official, or you can listen to it on Fridays at 4 o'clock p.m. on www.sensationalsoundsradio.net. This has certainly been a blessing. Reketta, this is, I tell you, we could sit another whole hour, but yeah. So, but we'll chat afterwards. But I want to thank everybody who tuned in today, whether you are viewing or whether you are listening. Thank you so much for supporting Life Matters with Michele, because this is the platform where we talk about what matters to you, you, and you. Well, that is the end of our show, and we hope to see you again next week. Be blessed and talk to you soon. Bye bye.